Some of the most asked questions on the stream have been things involving composition, qualification, and pug notions in general. So in this video, I'm going to be summarizing all the elements of my succinct thought process and hope to explain it for those new to Mythic plus pugging in general in an attempt to help you learn from my many years of mistakes. As such, I should warn you that this process should not be something people try to copy one for one. The reason it is my process is because it is something that matters to me specifically. Those things may not matter to everyone, and no one should be watching this expecting them to. I'm someone who has been doing serious PvE since I was a child, and that experience has shaped my outlook more than even I realized. But more importantly, I was someone who did a lot of challenge modes on many different tunes. I easily did as many challenge modes as I do Mythic Plus currently, and a lot of the things people think of when they think of challenge in Mythic Plus is just not what I think of, just because I've seen so many solutions to so many different problems in PvE over the many years. Also unique in this topic is my almost extreme affinity for pugging. This has allowed me to see far more problematic conditions than most of the top groups, and due to me doing it on stream, it has allowed me to be less strict with who and where I play with at times, allowing for a much more larger sample size. With all that said, it should be stated as clearly as possible again. These are my opinions, and they are based on doing mostly 17 to 19s in multiple seasons this expansion, with thousands of keys ran and sadly hundreds of keys finished. Pugging can be a cruel mistress at times, but I hope that this experience will help show you that if I can do it, you certainly can do it too. So let's begin by listing all the different factors in no particular order, then we will explain each one more in depth. Factor 1, composition. Factor 2, gear. Factor 3, Mythic plus score. Factor 4, PvE prowess. Factor 5, social red flags. And Factor 6, which we'll talk about later, realms. With so many different factors, it's easy to get lazy and condense it down into one or two, or place too much emphasis on certain things that don't really empirically lead to success. I often do this on stream and end up regretting it soon after, so take this as a moment to learn from my mistakes if you find any of it relevant. Now, let's discuss each factor in depth to help new players understand why they are important to me and give some examples of where they have gone right and wrong in the past. So we'll begin by talking about composition. In the early days of competitive 5Ns, there were many tricks and exploits that were so high impact you simply would never consider doing a run without a certain composition of groups. This is ultimately what led me to pugging so often, as it seemed like player skill and cohesion was just much less important than having 5 people playing the best specs per dungeon. This is no longer the case by any stretch of the imagination in BFA Mythic Plus, but there are still some very important boxes to check in any specific key. My ideal comp cannot be defined by a single class setup. So instead, let's do a little mini tier list of sorts to explain what I find most relevant for any group composition. First, we'll talk about tanking. I often tank myself, but removing me from the equation, I would prefer in this order. Tier 1, a tank with strong self-reliance. This is because a tank who can effectively solo the dungeon will allow the healer and DPS to be less mandatory to the success of said dungeon. This means something like Blood Death Knight, Vengeance Demon Hunter, or Protection Paladin. Tier 2, a tank with strong utility and the ability to produce dramatic results with it. This is because oftentimes pug teams only care about their numbers and not what else is needed for the success of their entire team. The tank slot is a perfect one to ensure key utility is present in the group, and it is not expected to produce numbers above all else, so if you ever need utility used properly, like interrupts, grips, Ring of Peace, this is a slot you're going to look for it in. So this means tanks like Brewmaster Monk, Protection Paladin, and Blood Death Knight. And Tier 3, a tank with above average offense. This is much less important to me than it would be for, say, the top groups that make the meta, and that is because oftentimes in order to maximize your tank DPS, you need to give up something significant that isn't relevant when you play at that level. It will require a lot of gear and practice to do well, and when you're pugging, expecting someone to go above the role standard calling is just not a realistic thing to do. On top of this, historically, the tanks that output the most damage are the ones populated by people playing tanks selfishly, meaning they may do a lot of damage, but will likely do so at the cost of many other intangible tank responsibilities within a dungeon. Currently, this means Protection Warrior, Vengeance Demon Hunter, or Protection Paladin. Next will be healing. As a frequent tank, it's much easier to notice what is and isn't useful in a healer, so this one's pretty good for me. Tier 1, useful utility. If the tank is playing well, the job of the healer is much easier to maximize, and the best way to impact the run after actually healing is to be bringing and using strong utility regularly. So this means something like Resto Shaman, Holy Paladin, or Resto Druid. Tier 2, significant DPS. If the healer did 0 healing, but more damage than an actual damage dealing slot, you would oftentimes be more successful than otherwise, especially coming from the perspective of a Blood Death Knight main. This is the most noticeable problem you're going to see when you pug. A healer who does 0 DPS is frankly a key killer, especially on lower keys where there's just very little to heal regularly. Because of this, I tend to prefer specs that can't help but DPS while also healing. So this means Holy Paladin, Discipline Priest, or Resto Shaman. And Tier 3, the ability to recover from major mistakes. So the big difference between top groups and pugging is going to be that mistakes will happen and you're going to need to recover from them without much hardship, otherwise you might be looking at a group disbanding. On average, this should be the least important thing that should be needed, because if it has to be relied on too often, the group simply is just not prepared for the task at hand. Either way, this means Resto Shaman, Holy Paladin, or Resto Druid. And DPS. Things are a little different here, as in terms of damage dealers, the slots are less individually important, as you have 3 of them compared to 1. But if there's going to be any real success, they need to be able to perform their maximum DPS output regardless of what route or mistakes might happen along the way. However, DPS is not all that matters for a damage dealer. And based on what else your group might look like, you may be forced to rely heavily on individual damage dealer slots, and this often creates a lot of issues, especially for me. So for me, Tier 1 is access to damage. Overall damage itself isn't some magical production that you could maximize easily. In order to be maximally effective, you need good access to damage, so you aren't doing high damage at the wrong times and low damage when it's needed the most throughout the dungeon. This means, of course, Havoc, but also Rogue, Elemental, Windwalker, and Frostmage. Tier 2, overall bulk. A massive issue you have when pugging is players playing below their qualification level at different times throughout the dungeon, and the best way to ensure this does not happen is by bringing specs and classes that can make mistakes and still be alive after doing so. This means, again, of course, Havoc, Bombkin, Rep Pally, or Rogue. And then Tier 3, mandatory utility. As mentioned, you want to avoid crutching on your damage dealers too often for key mechanics and utility, as frankly, there is relatively low chance they're going to participate willingly. Still, there are a variety of key utilities that are mandatory in many cases throughout dungeons, and having them should typically be more important than anything else. These are, for example, Shroud for many different dungeons, Havoc for Toll de Gore last boss, Warlock or Rogue for various Motherload skips, Soothe for Raging Weeks and certain mobs, and Battle Res / Lust when you have no other class viable candidates. So with all that explained, my ideal comp would actually look something like this. In the tank slot, it would either be a Protection Paladin, a Blood Death Knight, or a Brewmaster Monk. In the healer slot, it would either be a Holy Paladin, a Restoration Shaman, or a Restoration Druid. And in the DPS slot, it would be a Bombkin, an Elemental, or Frost Mage for ranged. And it would either be a Rogue, a Demon Hunter, or a Rep Paladin for melee. Obviously, you're probably going to want to have 2 melee to 1 range, depending on the week, depending on the comp. We won't go too much into that. So this discussion is different than my normal tier list ranking because it does not seek to isolate potential from these slots in a vacuum. For example, having a Paladin in any group is very strong for pugging, as their extreme bulk within their role allows them to have more than often likelihood of surviving mistakes, and with their wide utility that often offers group-wide preservation, you could find yourself with an invaluable pick in many different circumstances. Otherwise, you're going to be looking for classes with definite strengths, kind of like Blood Death Knights, magic defense, utility, and self-sustain, or perhaps Resto Shaman's extremely wide utility kit, including a range, interrupt, and stun, and of course, incredible CD kit, including Spirit Link. For damage, though, access to damage and bulk is best represented by a class like Bombkin, Demon Hunter, or Rogue, and many groups will require a Rogue before even considering a key if Shroud feels mandatory for upgrading it. This should be lessened in Season 4 though, but still, the same principles are going to apply. However, even when being careful and looking at all these factors evenly and often, many common mistakes still arise. Here are some of the most obvious and regular ones that I've experienced. Tier 1. You invite a spec for its utility, and they never use it. Happens most often with things like Bloodlust, Battle Res, and group sustainability like Darkness, Word of Glory, or Trents. I often invite classes on these grounds and end up wasting my own time taking less qualified candidates who simply end up not using their core invite purpose. Tier 2. Flavor of the Month specs. When the game features one class or spec having great relative power, regardless of why that is, you often see a high number of people playing the spec very selfishly. This was most notable in Season 2 of BFA when Outlaw Rogue simply dominated, and many people would play it without a high degree of mastery, yet still seemed qualified at a glance. Even though these classes could be innately powerful, you must be wary of what you're inviting. And tier 3, comp blindness. Sometimes I become comp blind in either direction. I spend too much time looking for a single excellent spec pick only to have sabotage myself, or I see overly qualified players that result in a composition that will make the dungeon much more complicated at one specific time. Remember, sometimes having things like battle res, shroud, or even immunities are just always better, and other times they just aren't. Know when and where to differentiate. Also, it should be noted that this is not a universal topic for every dungeon for every week. I could discuss that more in depth, but I believe I already have in the dungeon-specific new player guides I've released. I would also consider making a new player guide to affixes and affix combinations, so if you'd like to see that, just let me know down below. But for now, let's move on to less elaborate factors. Next up, let's talk about gear. One of the most common questions I get is, how geared do you need to be to do certain key levels? But that's simply just not how the game and this system works. For me, I generally look at someone who crosses certain gear thresholds as more qualified than he likely is, and that is because as a raid leader, I've seen strong players who are undergeared just fail to compete with those who have more established characters along the years. This is almost never applicable to Pugging though, but I fail to see through it quite often. As such, I will take somebody who is 450 over someone who is 440, but the difference is really very minor. Many times being 450 idle in the bags does not mean that they are that geared in the dungeon either. Someone who is under 430, however, should demonstrate a lack of commitment or at least a fresh character in some capacities. So there are things to be learned, at least before Season 4, when many of these things will change. For example, if someone is under 400 item level, they simply just aren't doing keys regularly. Even doing 2s, you would be more geared than that, but that does not mean that they cannot complete said key that you're looking to do. So take all gear with a grain of salt. You are never required to be a certain item level to do keys, but if you did keys often enough to be doing higher and higher keys regularly, you would be much more geared just by playing gradually. Even if you were only 300 item level, a group could still find success with you in there. Oftentimes, people would just say you're being carried, and that's not false, but it's also not entirely true either. Remember, your key is the only access to the dungeon that this group might have available. So if you're undergeared, don't feel bad about inviting people who are much more established than you are. As long as you play well and don't die constantly, you didn't have to keep up with them for this group to be successful. Here are two key examples to be noted from recent stream history. We saw a 450 vastly overqualified Fury Warrior sign up to my 13 key on my Brewmaster alt. He had some of the best items in the game, including 2 450 socketed trinkets, but for whatever reason, he only had one weapon equipped, meaning he barely did more damage than the other 430s and lower in my group. Trolling, idiocy, or whatever else it was, this does happen occasionally. People who are extremely overgeared should be looked at as a double-edged sword sometimes, as they may only be in there to test a new spec or otherwise somehow not live up to their potential. Another example would be the No Essence tunes I explored recently. Both started very undergeared for the season, but because they were Brewmaster and Resto Druid respectively, I was able to push them faster through keys than most people would think is possible. The Brewmaster especially was able to complete an 11 motherload at only 366 item level with no essences and green trinkets, and went on to later upgrade a 16 motherload within only about a few weeks with only 428 item level under those same conditions with essences. In the end, the number one thing to remember is that the only universal value of gear is actually your health pool. And if you aren't doing keys that are going to threaten your life every single pull, gear really shouldn't be of great concern, provided you don't have multiple people also undergeared that they're going to get crushed by all the different unavoidable mechanics. Next factor we look at is Mythic plus score. This is a pretty controversial topic for many reasons, and I've made multiple videos on this topic already, so I'm not going to go into why Mythic plus is frankly an irrelevant metric for Pugging most days, but instead I'm going to focus on why it is useful. But again, remind you to look at that like item level, it can be useful, but it's not needed, mandatory, or frankly even relevant thanks to how many fixes work together. So for me, the key usage of score is to make sure they've actually done keys, at least around the level in question. Someone who is less than, say, 1,000 score signing up to a plus 15 is not ever going to be considered for me, even though, again, they likely are perfectly capable of getting carried, quote-unquote, through it, if only because it means that they don't do keys often enough to demonstrate their dedication to progression to be in a group like mine. Similarly, someone vastly overqualified is also someone I'd prefer not to take to my key, as I frankly worry about their intentions. Oftentimes, it's better to err on the lower score side if you're only concerned with completing the key, and and it's better to err on the higher side if you're only worried about pushing the key. But the system just takes too few things into account to produce consistent results. The best way to use it is simply on a gross scale. Just make sure you aren't inviting someone who has never done any serious keys to your serious key, and you'll be fine. Personally though, if I am not doing a serious key, score becomes the absolute lowest factor for me. This means a key 4+ levels lower than my current progression point, or especially a lower key I'm doing simply to help a friend out. Next thing I might consider is what I'd call PvE prowess. The main thing that most people use the Raider.io add-on for is seeing score, but luckily it does actually provide much more pertinent information at a glance. The website itself tells an even more complete story, so between these two things you can always choose to go really in-depth when looking at your candidates. For me, the most useful information instead of a progression-focused score would be simply repeat clears. Any PvEer should know that the first time you kill a Mythic raid boss and the 15th time you kill said Mythic raid boss are very, very different encounters. In fact, one of the key differences is how much faster the kill usually is. So ironically, Raider.io failing to account for repeat clears and this type of experience, especially given certain affix combinations, is the biggest blunder that can simply be made for pugging, and the number one thing I'd like to see from a candidate. I usually quickly look to make sure the player has at least as many +15s in time as I do, which you can see on the add-on, or at least enough to recognize that they didn't just do keys only on a push week or something like that, or worse, simply pay for score boosts, which does actually happen more than you might think. On top of this, I also like to look at their raid progress, especially with Eternal Palace. I feel like you can learn a lot from this, as currently the raid has 3 distinct boss levels. The first 3 bosses are extremely easy, the next 3 are progressively harder than the previous, and the final 2 are some of the most complicated and difficult encounters ever in the video game, especially in their pre-nerf state. This tells me that an 8 of 8 Mythic Raider must understand first how to dedicate to success in long-term PvE, and more so, that they are capable enough of understanding how to stay alive, do mechanics, and maximize their DPS at the same time. It's certainly not entirely relevant, and I would never extend this into other content paths like, say, PvP, but the way I look at it, if you see someone who is 1500 but 8 of 8 Mythic, and someone who is 1750 with no raiding experience attached, the 1500 should be a more reliable and level-headed player for your key, especially because the difference between those scores can just be exceedingly irrelevant sometimes. Finally, let's move on to social red flags, which are a much more complicated topic. These last 2 things we're going to be talking about here elaborate on more of a baseline than a metric. This means they're purely negative, and in their absence, you don't actually gain anything. You just limit your chance to fail. This is truly the big difference between pugging and stable progression groups, and frankly requires a bit of psychological outlook to attempt to buck any trends here. As such, it's likely best to look at these as advanced pugging concerns only. And if you're putting a group together for the first time, just allow ignorance to be bliss. But after 4 expansions of frequent pugging and a huge focus on working with the World of Warcraft community, I have come to notice many things I would consider to be red flags when pugging. So another tier list here. Tier 1, excessive communication before being invited to the group. This is actually the number one way to get yourself excluded from any group I form, and has been the most consistent thing that has put me off over the many years of pugging. For better or worse, pugging applications are very much an at-a-glance process, and if someone tries to circumvent that process, I immediately assume they're trying to hide something, or at best are very inexperienced with the social norms of pugging. I've been known to decline perfectly qualified applications many times simply because they tried to contact me before I even consider them. This means linking random achievements, embellishing their qualifications in text, or otherwise pointless chatter. To illustrate, I'll paraphrase a good friend Tokes, who I believe has said it best. The higher number of characters typed when making a group is directly proportional to a lack of success. Tier 2, overall poor etiquette in the group finder itself. Specifically, not directly contacting me, but posting a bunch of wordy, irrelevant stuff in their application description, which oftentimes is just pure embellishment or childish meme speak, attempting to either sound better than they are, or like they are somehow cooler than the other people signing up. This means pointless text like I pump or I know the dungeons, embellishment or flat out lies about what they're doing, especially about their item level or score, which I can literally see without them telling me about it, and otherwise memes used as a form of endearment or perhaps as a defense mechanism against the disappointment that comes with signing up to dozens of keys at a time and getting declined by all of them. Tier 3 excessive communication after being invited to the group. This is something that's become relatively famous in terms of criticisms of me and how I approach group building when pugging, but after years of playing challenging content with effectively zero communication groups, I've come to learn that frankly, the less speaking, the better. Keys, even with the variance that is enforced weekly via fixed combinations, are largely repetitive and predictable. You know when and where problems might arise, when and where you would or wouldn't use CDs, and how mistakes can be circumvented. A group that has zero to say usually means they're all perfectly satisfied with their role and expectations in the group and are focused on their performance purely. A group that is talking a lot, on the other hand, especially about things that are irrelevant to the dungeon, but also even about things everyone should already understand before even doing a key, should not universally be looked at as a problem. But for me, I find over time that the more chatter when things are going well, the more chatter when things are going wrong. And in those times, it's of the most extreme importance that that chatter does not erupt into aggression, because that certainly will end the key early. To illustrate, my ideal key would be with the party chat feature turned off entirely by Blizzard, as there is generally so little constructive communication that happens in the text chat that I look at it as a detriment to even have it for things other than add-on announcements. This means chatter about irrelevant things, over discussion of mechanics, especially that aren't taking place until the very end of the dungeon, which people will have forgotten by then, and demanding information that is incidental to their role, like making the tank link a route or something. And Tier 4, perhaps most notable, is immature or selfish presentation. This is a bit of a blanket term, but typically, if you see someone being childish or selfish before a key starts, this action is going to continue into the key, meaning at the first sign of issue, the player is going to either tilt or simply leave. Some key examples of this include names that are immature, offensive, or include memes, being in a group for the entire group building process and somehow still requiring a summon, delaying the group for things like talents or consumables after everyone has gathered for the dungeon and receive summons, and perhaps most controversially, applying to my group and playing a spec or talent build that demonstrates selfish play. So let's elaborate on that final point a bit, as it's recently caused something of a bit of a stir. Right now, in my opinion, Elemental Shaman and Balanced Druid are two of the strongest specs in the entire game for pugging especially, and certainly the strongest range. Thanks to poor design from the World of Warcraft development team, but also from the Raider.io add-on, there is no quick and easy way to see if a Shaman or a Druid signing up are Enhance or Feral instead of Elemental or Balance. And I personally believe anyone playing those classes seriously would understand that in comparison, the choice should always be clear. On top of this, I have had many players try to disguise their choices in a variety of ways, lie about their intentions with their spec or talents, and otherwise try to rationalize their decisions ahead of my own interests. Not everyone will or should care about this as much as I do, but with the amount of pugging I have done, I take it as a universal truth that a person choosing to play Enhance or Feral in keys is doing it either selfishly or because of a lack of dedication towards success with the class. When I pug, a Shaman playing Enhance, a Druid playing Feral, a Balanced Druid not taking Trents, or a Rep Paladin not taking Word of Glory are going to be immediately discounted and lowered to the bottom of the potential list for me. This again is not because these specs are unviable or not productive, but simply because choosing them demonstrates selfish or non-competitive play that can easily be rectified by simply switching specs or talents. It's not about reinforcing a meta. It's simply about what gives a zero communication group like the one I'm forming the best chance to succeed. And any of these selfish presentations make me immediately dubious of said selection, although much less than those I ranked above them, which should really say something about that. And finally, we come to the hotly debated topic of realm when used as a factor for pugging and the odd stigmas associated with the various notable realms. I don't want this to feel like the focus of this video, and frankly, this could really have its own topic of a video on its own, but sadly, it is a factor that I just cannot ignore while pugging, so it needs to be discussed here. In truth, there should be no reason that a single realm of potentially thousands of potential players should all be considered problematic, and I understand why saying otherwise sounds like bigotry or whatever else, but it's important to distance yourself from that reaction that I feel gets overdrawn thanks to modern day tensions and poor relations between separate peoples existing in the North America continent. So as far as I'm concerned, these are the important things that you should be aware of, and instead you should ask yourself if any of these things would be a problem for you. Also, remember that this is only relevant for United States, North America realms. There may be similar trends on the EU realms, but I'm not going to be able to discuss them here as I don't know anything about them. So the realm RAGNAROS and its associated connections contain a higher than normal portion of Spanish-speaking players. In my experience, language barrier is barely a factor as mentioned earlier, but it can be very difficult to communicate when it is a factor. And more importantly, it can be difficult to get them to react to a situation on the fly if needed. Somehow, it also seems that a higher than normal amount of players are incapable of playing the game at the same level as their metrics might suggest. It's been suggested to me that this is because of an us versus them mentality that has developed over the years, leading to serious players leaving the realm and it not having a higher percentage of players with chips on their shoulder instead of less interested players helping the group or caring what others think about them in said groups. Then we have the realm AZRALON and its associated connections containing a higher than normal portion of Portuguese-speaking players, especially from the country Brazil, which although is similar in language etiquette to Spanish, it is not the same language and can make further misunderstandings happen when you have both Spanish, Portuguese, and English players all attempting to communicate. Again, somehow it also seems that a higher than normal amount of players from this realm set are playing on less than perfect internet connections and display elitism more often on average. I've seen many disconnects and many more arguments come from players in these realms than I would ever expect to see in any other given similar sample size. We also have the realm ILLIDAN inexplicably having a high, very high actually, percentage of Chinese speaking players, which is particularly confusing as Asian realms do exist, suggesting that these are American citizens who simply speak Chinese over English. Typically, I do not notice any other problematic trends that might be noticeable specifically from this realm, but as it seems like a much greater percentage of players on Illidan do speak Chinese as their first language, there were issues with communication within any realm, it would most likely be a problem here more than anywhere else, especially as Chinese is not a language native to this continent at all. Also have the realm Zul'Jin having a higher than normal proportion of French-speaking players, although seemingly less than other realms in question. It's been explained to me that this is because of very large French-only guilds congregating on that realm, made up of mostly players from Canadian areas. It has been very rare in my experience that these players don't also speak English, but I did have one famous moment on stream during Legion, during a cathedral run where I was in a group with 4 other players from this realm who were apparently complaining about me the entire dungeon in French. This is too small of a sample size to draw much else off though regardless. One other realm to note is TICHONDRIUS, which was famous for being a haven for all US top PvPers before cross-realm play and the like changed that landscape. I don't typically PvP at all, and honestly I don't think many of those players would cross over into Pugging Mythic Plus, but the famous gladiator guilds do still exist and you see 1 or 2 relatively frequently when you're pugging. When you do, I expect less success from a player who does not make PvE their main focus in this game, and also typically higher than average aggression when runs are not perfect, due partially to PvPers feeling forced to PvE to supplement gear they might need for PvP. So those are the most noticeable remarks and all come from some of the largest realms out there, which has led to more consistency in the reporting of these trends for what it may be worth. Again, this isn't about making blanket bigoted statements about people from different walks of life. It's just about having the highest chance for success when forming a random group. Even though there should be no issue at all based on location, even language, or especially realm choice, somehow these trends have been consistently reported and cannot be discounted. For me, it's more about odds than anything else. If there's a factor that makes my choice 1% less likely to succeed than another choice, I cannot accept them. And that same mentality is something that follows me through all of the previously discussed factors. So I hope this detailed look into my thought process when pugging has been helpful to you guys. It should also be noted that this is almost exclusively relevant if you yourself are the one putting said group together, which you really should be if you're new, to ensure you can progress on your own time frame without having to fight crowds to get into somebody else's key. Remember, when doing that, just because you weren't accepted to other people's keys does not mean you are not capable of doing the content, or also does not mean that you are not qualified for the content. It just means that there were other people out there applying who were more qualified than you. And instead of getting upset by this, you should look at this as a chance to improve your standing in these viewable metrics, as no matter how important or not important they may be, they are the field of play for pugging, and you must overcome them if you wish to win on this field. One final tip I will give is oftentimes 2 cohesive players can be much more likely to succeed than a full 5-player pug, and can be much more fun and rewarding to play with as well. You can still pug and succeed with one friend who complements your playstyle, or even look for groups queuing as 2 to add to your group, hoping for a similar situation on their end. I tend to avoid groups any larger than 2 though, as it's usually people solely looking for a certain key type, and this likely means if one small thing goes wrong with any of those people, they will all create bigger issues than if they were individuals, and that will just disband your key quicker. At the very least, I hope this multi-layered topic, almost psychological in nature, illustrates just how rich a tapestry this game can still present in 2020. There are many factors to consider, and you may be just as successful ignoring most of them and relying on blind luck, but I do wish I could see the concept through the eyes of a trained clinician, if only to see how my reactions to these trends might differ. Anyway, if after watching this you still have any questions, please let me know. I try to respond to every single comment and question I get here on YouTube, and believe I have created a healthy, pug-minded environment around this channel. So encourage you to join the Discord and follow the instructions to get permissions within, and expect you'll find many other players in a similar situation to your own once you do. So, thanks for watching, and we will see you guys in the next one.